Hi, I'm Andrew Lewen, founder of SpeakUpForBlue.com, a place where ocean conservation meets the world. The oceans have undergone a tremendous change over the past 5 decades. No matter the causes of the changes, the oceans are increasing in temperature and nutrients, increasing in acidity, and the seas are rising. No other habitat has felt the impacts from these changes more than reefs. Some scientists are predicting the complete destruction of reefs by 2050 if we do not reduce and eliminate the causes of these changes. One solution is to install reef balls. But what's a reef ball? Well, that's what my guest will answer today. Todd Barber, chairman of Reef Ball Foundation. Hi, Todd. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Todd, before we go into deep into what Reef Ball Foundation is all about, can you give me a brief description of Reef Ball for the listeners?
The Reef Ball product or the Reef Ball Foundation?
The Reef Ball Foundation in general.
The Reef Ball Foundation is a publicly supported 501c3 nonprofit organization that functions as an international NGO, and we work to rehabilitate marine reefs. We use designed artificial reefs called reef balls in a variety of different sizes and shapes and forms to address issues globally that affect marine ecosystems and habitats like reefs, not just coral reefs, but temperate reefs, cold water reefs, a whole range of different types of underwater ecosystems. We've done work in over 60 countries, and we've built more than 5,000 reefs with more than 500,000 reef balls deployed around the world.
Wow. Okay, that's fantastic. Now, before we really dive into the nitty-gritty of the Reef Ball Foundation and reef balls in general, I just wanted our listeners and our audience to get a sort of information on yourself. So, can you just tell me where you're originally from?
My family is originally from Greenville, South Carolina, where I was raised. My mother owned a dive shop growing up. My father owned a company that builds amusement rides, and he's a well-known inventor with over 40 patents to his name that have gone commercial. And I grew up in sort of an environment of they're doing a lot of scuba diving and loving reefs, having aquariums most of my life, and traveling down to the Cayman Islands quite a bit. And went off and went to the University of Georgia and got an undergraduate degree in small business management and computers. And then I went off to London School of Economics and got a master's degree in international business. And after that, moved to Atlanta and lived there for 10 years, practicing as a sales management consultant. And from there is when I started the Reef Ball Foundation as a little volunteer company, and it took off, and I've been doing it ever since.
That's fantastic. So your background is a real mix of really enjoying the ocean through scuba diving and aquariums, and then moving into a business background. Now, is there a reason why you went towards economics instead of sort of maybe marine biology?
Well, when I first went to college, I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I remember when I was trying to select a major in college, my father said, well, if you get a business degree, you don't have to make that choice until you leave school, because you can do business for anything.
Right.
But if you go and you become an accountant, you can be an accountant for anything, but you're always going to be, doing accounting. So he said, why don't you do something like, marketing or small business management or something like that. That way you don't have to choose just yet. And so that's sort of the advice I followed. And sure enough, it kind of led me into, I always had a passion for traveling. I love traveling around the world ever since I've been a kid, backpacking in Europe, and fascinated by other cultures and other lands. And the earth is getting so small. So the international business degree made sense. Mm-hmm. And I was really, really fortunate. I think one of the keys to Reef Ball success and my own personal success, when I was 14 years old, I was playing flag football with some friends, and I fell down and broke my arm. And when I got home that day, my father bought me one of the very first personal computers that was out there. It was called the Tandy Radio Shack TRS-80. For any of these old folks out there listening, you might even remember that model. But it gave me, probably anybody older than me does not understand computers very well. They've only sort of learned it in adulthood. It's kind of like a language. If you learn it when you're a child, it's second nature. If you learn it as an adult, you always have an accent.
Right.
So I was that first generation that really understood computers. And that sort of gave everything an edge. So I had the combination of a huge hobby in science from my father, and because of his amusement rides, we were able to use lights to light up my aquarium, and I was one of the very first people to be able to grow hard corals in an aquarium, so I understood the structure of reefs and, watched it for hours at home. I had a mom who owned a dive shop and traveled around the world and learned great dive skills. And then finally the business all came together and taught me how to turn my passions into a business that could sustain me, enough to put a roof over my head and food in my mouth. And that was the other thing my father taught me. It wasn't important to be rich. It's just important to always know that you'll have, health care, a roof over your head, and food in your mouth. And he said, I can tell you, Todd, you get those educational degrees, that'll happen one way or the other. And
Right.
that.
Yeah, no, definitely sound advice. I'm curious. I'm a marine aquarium hobbyist as well, so I understand the challenge to not only grow hard corals but maintain a marine aquarium today, where the technology has been quite advanced from even 10 years ago. When you started and you, how challenging was it to maintain a reef?
It was incredibly challenging because I was trying to do it in Atlanta, Georgia. I had literally converted my entire dining room into one aquarium.
Right.
We had basically the lights of an amusement park, big metal halide lights, which generated a ton of heat and required a lot of attention to that temperature. And I had to have refrigerators with coils going through to keep the water cool enough. Very fortunately, a friend of mine was working for a medical supply store, and he was able to get hold of, for me, an oxygen concentrator.
Okay.
So I built by hand about a 5-foot tall protein skimmer, again, using some of my dad's knowledge of engineering, and we would pump pure oxygen through that. And of course, we didn't have redox probes then. We had to guess at it by the marine biology, so you had to look at your tank every day and see how things were doing and adjust your controls based on sight sometimes.
Right.
And then, of course, Albert Thiel had written his famous book on reef keeping, so we knew a little bit about nitrates and I had brought back a mangrove tree and had a little refugia tank set up. We didn't know anything about reverse daylight photosynthesis back then, so water quality would always go up and down a little bit during the day.
Right.
And but it was, that was part of the reason why I think reef balls today have paid such an attention to detail, because if I put something out there to create a reef, I want it to perform just as well as it did in that tank, which was essentially what's happening to the world is one giant polluted ocean, and an aquarium kind of simulates that on a small scale pretty quickly if you don't do what's right to keep it balanced.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's fantastic, because I've always thought, having a reef aquarium it really gives you a perspective of how quickly things can change when things go wrong. And
very fast. Yeah, you can wake up the next day and your whole tank's full of cyanobacteria, the red slime all over the thing, and you're like, just one little thing I did wrong, and it caused the whole thing to crash overnight.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also makes you think of, for me, if I have algae, along the bottom of my tank, instead of always trying to vacuum it up, I try and find a natural way to get it. So I try and look for a fish or some hermit crabs that will actually, kind of putting it in to get rid of it. So you really, you also get a really good background on the functional process of each animal.
Yeah, and that's exactly why, in Reef Balls we paid such attention to little tiny details like making habitats for sea urchins and things like that on each reef ball, because as you know, everybody might say, oh, I want to build a reef because I'd like to see a pretty turtle.
Right.
And that's fine, but that turtle poops and, as you know, and creates a little spot where the algae's, going to grow, and something's got to clean that up. So you got to have the janitors in the sea, and everything keeps it in balance. And I can tell you that the more diverse I could make my tanks in general, the more robust they were from handling bad things that would happen to the reef. Right. So you'll hear me talk a lot about biodiversity, and it may not mean a lot to a lot of people, but it really means a lot when it comes to the health of a reef. And a reef that's got 10,000 different species on it is much more likely to survive some kind of an impact than a reef that's got 3 species.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I completely agree. Now, moving forward, Where did you get the idea for Reef Ball? Was it because of your background, taking care of these aquariums, and then your business background to actually start a business or even a nonprofit?
No, it was purely out of, go back to the whole story. My first scuba dive was when I was 14 years old in the Cayman Islands.
Okay.
And my family every year would rent a little villa on the north side of Cayman Islands. And we would, basically, would take a scuba tank and I would go out 100 yards off of this little villa and I would just sit on the bottom. And there was this reef that was about the size of a current average size reef ball that was on the ground,
Mm-hmm.
10 foot of water, and I would weigh myself down and I would just sit there for hours and look at it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was like my underwater aquarium. So instead of taking a dive boat out, every time I went back, I'd go just sit on the bottom. I knew every little fish that lived on that reef, every visitor that would come by. It was just very entertaining to me.
Right.
I would take a picture of the corals growing every year, and I was always comparing that back to the rates of growth I was getting in my tank. And my idea was, can I get my corals to grow as fast as they do in the wild and keep them alive as healthily?
Mm-hmm.
And finally, one year, we went back. This was probably in the late 80s, and Hurricane Gilbert I had taken a vacation with my father and my brother where we had taken a sailboat from Fort Lauderdale over to Bimini. And it was supposed to be a 4-hour crossing. It turned up into an 18-hour crossing, and we hit 60-foot seas, which is 120 foot from crest to trough, in a 41-foot sailboat. And it was one of those near-death experiences. I can remember when we were getting close to land, the sea was getting a little bit calmer, but we couldn't see land yet. We didn't have GPS navigation in those days. And I remember my father saying, if we don't see land in the next 20 minutes, we're going to have to circle around all night because we can't, sail into reef waters at night.
Right.
I remember thinking, if you start sailing around, I'm just going to jump in and swim.